Back when I reviewed the Fantex P300A, it was a breath of fresh air. Literally. It's a smallish form factor, affordable case with a mesh front panel and very minimal lighting or gimmicks to speak of. So basically the opposite of the cases I usually end up falling for. But I did fall for it, and I fell hard. But then something else came along. Something bigger, something more intimidating, something pricey, something that's just completely over the top in almost every possible way, and that something is MSI's MPG Sekira 500X. And in this review, we'll see whether this behemoth of a case can win me back over to the dark side. The dark side being big, beastly, flashy cases with potentially restrictive airflow. But before that, if you want to pick up any of the parts I'll be mentioning in this video, go ahead and do it via my Amazon affiliate links in the description down below to help me out. Or if you're in South Africa, grab it at Wootware to help yourself out to some awesome deals and some really amazing service. Now, when I say that this case is a behemoth, I really mean it. It's about as big as you can get for a mid-tower case at 54 centimeters tall, 23 centimeters wide, and 53 centimeters thick. And it weighs in at a friggin' crazy 20 kilograms, which makes it the biggest and definitely heaviest case I've ever worked with. I mean, just getting this thing out of the box took so much effort that it actually convinced me to go back to the gym for the first time in like 4 years. And you know what? There's something in my monkey brain that kind of respects that. The weight and size of the case helps me see it as more of a piece of engineering rather than a toy, which is the impression I get from a lot of smaller form factor cases. My back be damned. The justification for the case's unapologetic heft becomes clear as soon as you take the plastic off and are met with a giant hunk of metal and glass, formed into a neat, clean, big boy box. The case features tinted glass in the front and top, along with 2 glass side panels complete with hinges and a little handle, making them look like little doors, and I absolutely love it. The hinged swing doors are easily my favorite solution to the removable case side panel thing. Not having to deal with those annoying thumb screws or risk slicing my arm open if I'm not careful with the panel is a godsend. And while it can be a little finicky to get the panels on and off the hinges sometimes, it's still a lot quicker than having to secure them with those like crappy thumb screws. It also cuts down a lot on fingerprints, which is a real nice bonus. Of course, it's not just all the glass that makes this case such a chonker. The aluminum and steel this thing is forged out of also helps a lot. The metal frame of the case is phenomenally solid and impressively precise, with almost no part of the construction feeling loose, fragile, or cheap in any way. Clearly, MSI was way more concerned about build quality here than weight, and I for one applaud them for it. And I would applaud them even more if they stuck to it throughout the case's design. The parts in the front and top panels that aren't decked out with glass are covered in what feels like plastic paneling. And while the plastic is brushed and looks dope, feel-wise compared to the glass and metal, it doesn't quite share the same kind of like premium touch. The plastic vents between those panels and the rest of the case share the same problem, amplified by the fact that they feel a little more fragile than the rest of the case, and at least on this unit, one section of it was like a little loose. But again, the main reason these plastic parts seem a little cheap is because the rest of the case feels like the exact opposite. And the case doesn't just feel expensive and premium, it has the looks to back it up. It's sleek and intimidating, kind of like a B-2 bomber minus the crazy angles, and the mix of tinted glass panels and the brushed plastic finish looks fantastic. Combine all of that with the air intake grills in the front, top, and bottom of the case, basically framing the side panels, and we've got a mighty sexy case on our hands here. Unfortunately, what's not quite so sexy is the price MSI slapped onto this thing. Right now, the case is selling for around $360, or 4,800 Rand here in South Africa. And if you're on anything resembling a tight budget, then that's a pretty sheesh price. Did not use that correctly. But just because I'm too broke to afford it doesn't mean that the pricing is unjustified. With all the glass and metal that went into this thing, along with a few other pricey extras we'll be getting to in just a minute, the price tag actually makes a lot of sense. Helping to make the pricing of the case a lot more palatable is its clean, spacious interior, which features support for motherboards all the way up to E-ATX, while the front of the case has mounts for up to 280mm rads, and the top can handle a full-fat 360mm rad. A custom loop would absolutely kill in this thing. And speaking of the top radiator, I have to give MSI some major credit for the modular mounting bracket they tossed in here. Mounting radiators is probably one of my least favorite parts of any build, just below cable managing RGB cables. So being able to remove the bracket, mount the radiator to the bracket outside of the case, then just sliding it all back in is some next level convenience. And for all of the air cooling gang members out there, up to 2 200mm, 3 140mm, and 3 120mm fans can be mounted in the front, while the top features the same support minus one 140mm fan And of course, we have support for a 120 or 140 mm fan at the back. And speaking of fans, here's where things get even more interesting. Unlike far too many other cases, MSI decided not to be stingy with pre-installed fans when it comes to the 500X. Not only do we get the usual 120 mm fan at the back, we also get 4 massive 200 mm fans, 2 of which are mounted in the front and the other 2 mounted in the top. And to sweeten the deal even further, all but one of those fans are ARGB, which makes sense since the one without LEDs can't be seen from the outside of the case anyway. And to those of you worried about connecting all of those lights, don't, because MSI also includes an 8-port ARGB hub with the case, which is hooked up to a button that you can use to play around with a bunch of different effects. Or if you'd prefer to control the lights via software, just connect the controller to your motherboard's J-Rainbow header and hold down the button for a few seconds to give your motherboard control over the lights. And since we're on the topic of I/O, you won't want for anything with the 500X. Along with the power and LED buttons, and the usual audio and mic ports, we also have 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports and a 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port to cap it off. Man, I can't say those things. Anyway, just make sure the motherboard you'll be pairing with the case has enough headers to actually connect to those, or you'll be missing out. Storage-wise, the case features 4 3.5-inch bays at the bottom of the case, complete with toolless sleds that make installing those drives an absolute breeze, along with 3 mounts for 2.5-inch drives. That ease of installation pretty much goes for the entire case. Everything from the hinged side panels, the removable radiator sled, the plug-and-play drive sleds, and the relatively well-placed rubber grommets for cable management, and then even just like the amount of room to work with inside the case makes building in it a dream. That being said though, it's not all perfect. While there's a ton of horizontal space to work in, vertical space is a little more limited with the top-mounted radiator installed. With the rad and fans installed on the top 2 centimeters or so of the motherboard is completely blocked off, which isn't great from a looks or access perspective. This can be avoided if you install the radiator fans above rather than below the radiator, but doing so in my case would have blocked my view of the MPG Core Liquid 360R's fancy ARGB fans. So, no. Another more minor issue I had was the lack of a third cable management grommet in the top of the PSU shroud. This makes routing any cable that connects to the bottom right of the motherboard a little awkward and removes the possibility of routing GPU power connectors underneath the card. Of course, if you want to mount your GPU vertically, which you can totally do in this case, then you're not going to see any of that. Although you'll probably see worrying GPU thermals since the fans of the card will probably be placed very, very close to the glass panel. Speaking of things too close to glass side panels, while cable management is pretty decent in the 500X thanks to a ton of tied-on points and included Velcro straps, there's not really a lot of clearance to work with. In order to be able to close the side panel, which uses magnets to stay closed, cables have to be flattened out significantly, or the panel will just pop open constantly. It can be done, you'll just have to pay special attention to your cable management. The last little annoyance I ran into is that the sexy front panel, while sexy, is a little hard to deal with. Because the bright, beautifully diffused light strip and MSI logo are embedded right in the front panel, whenever you remove it, you have to be very careful not to yank the cables out in the process. And it also means that the front panel is pretty much permanently connected to the case via those cables, which isn't ideal. Overall, even with those mostly nitpicky issues taken into account, this is still one of the easiest and fun cases I've ever built in. Now, with all that out of the way, it's about time we get to what could be this case's biggest and potentially only real downfall: thermals. This is, after all, a case with a closed front and top panel, with the only sources of fresh air being the grills on the side of each panel, and that could spell very bad news for the 500X. So let's get to it. For our test system, we're using a Ryzen 7 3800XT running at stock settings, cooled by MSI's MPG Core Liquid 360R, MSI's X570 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard, 32 gigs of Crucial's Ballistics RGB memory, and MSI's RTX 3070 Gaming X Trio also running at stock clocks. For testing, I manually set the CPU and GPU fan speeds to a static 70% and 60% respectively, a pump speed of 70%, and we were working with an ambient temp of 25 degrees. The first configuration I tested was full stock, meaning all panels and fans were configured exactly as they are out of the box, and I ran case fan speed at both 40% and 90%. And at 40% case fan speed, during our CPU focus workload, the 3800XT maxed out at 84 degrees, while during our GPU focus test, the 3070 maxed out at 73 degrees. And running at 90% fan speed, we saw the numbers drop to 83 and 70 degrees respectively. While totally within spec and cool enough to prevent either part from thermal throttling, those temps aren't exactly ideal. Closed panels being crap for airflow aside, another major reason those massive 200mm fans aren't cooling as well as you might expect comes down to said fans having almost no room to breathe. I mean, we're probably talking like a centimeter of clearance here between the fans and their respective panels. I believe this is probably MSI's single biggest oversight when it comes to the case's cooling performance. Come on MSI, give these bad boys some air. And give them air is exactly what I did in my next round of testing. For this round, I removed both the case's front and top panels and tested CPU and GPU again. And unsurprisingly, we saw temps drop, although not as dramatically as I expected. At 40% case fan speed, we saw the CPU temp drop by 3 degrees to 81, and GPU temp drop from 73 to 64. And at 90% case fan speed, we saw the numbers drop by a further 1 degree each. On the CPU front, the temperature difference really wasn't as much as I expected, but the 3070 appreciated the fresh air a heck of a lot more, with the card running 13% cooler than with the panels on. Now, while testing so far has focused on the CPU and GPU individually, we should also look at temps while both are under load, since that's a more likely scenario for most of us gamers. And it's here where we see things shake up a lot more. With a static case fan speed of 90% with all the panels on, we saw CPU maxing out at a toasty 91 degrees, and GPU not too far behind at 74 degrees. After removing those panels, CPU temp dropped to 82 degrees, its biggest drop yet, and GPU temp slid comfortably into 64 degrees. What all this tells us is that, shocker, a case with closed panels is a bit of a hotbox. And to a slightly lesser extent, that even though the 200mm fans are big and beautiful, without room to breathe, they're primarily there to look good and be quiet rather than keeping everything cool. And luckily, being quiet is one of the things they really excel at. With the case all closed up, I can only really start to hear the case fans clearly when I crank power up to 80% or higher. And with the panels off, even my AIO sounds a lot louder than all the case fans combined. At least that benefit from large fans isn't lost here. What I think MSI could do if they wanted to improve the case's airflow without taking too much away from the overall look or low noise levels, or what you could do if you're handy with power tools, is work mesh into the front panel right above the glass, letting the topmost 200mm fan do its job. That alone would ensure that a heck of a lot more fresh air makes its way into the system. Something that could be somewhat achieved by the ability to mount the two 200mm fans in the front of the case to the inside of the chassis so they'd have about 3 centimeters to breathe rather than the 1 centimeter or so they have right now. Unfortunately for these specific fans, that would mean sacrificing 2 of the hard drive bays and would diminish the wow factor seeing the RGB fan through the window has. But honestly, that's a sacrifice I'd personally be okay with making, if given the option. Overall, MSI's MPG Sekira 500X is a bit of a tough sell if you care more about performance than aesthetics. Performance isn't horrible, especially if you're using the case for like a gaming system where both CPU and GPU aren't being slammed the whole time, but it's definitely one of the hotter cases around. If, however, you are planning on dropping your gaming rig in the 500X, aren't too bothered by less than ideal temperatures, and want a case that looks phenomenal, then this could tick a lot of your boxes. The case really is remarkably pretty, with premium touches all over the place and RGB elements that look absolutely sick, especially through the tinted tempered glass. And yeah, that's all folks. Props to MSI for sending the 500X over for me to check out, and thanks to everyone who made it this far into the video. And remember to hit all the buttons for more videos like this. If you're ready to pull the trigger on the case or anything else I mentioned in this video, feel free to use my Amazon affiliate links in the description down below. Or if you're in South Africa, pick everything up at Woodwear if you're a true fan. And yeah, catch you all in the next one. Cheers.